Hey, I'm Tamara Kendacker, and you're listening to the Decibel from the Globe and Mail. So imagine you're in a situation where you need to call 911. Maybe you've been kidnapped, and your kidnapper doesn't know that you have your phone on you, but they're right there, so you can't make any phone calls. Wouldn't it be great to be able to text the police? Send them a photo of the kidnapper or where you are? It's 2021 and we somehow still can't do that. Our current emergency communication system is based on 1970s technology, and it has a number of other issues too, but it's getting a major upgrade.
Basically, right now, what's happening is the biggest overhaul to emergency communications that we've seen in decades. And this is not just happening in Canada, it's happening worldwide.
Alexandra Posadzki is the Globe's telecoms reporter, and she's been covering the effort to overhaul the 911 system. Today on the Decibel, the ways in which our 911 system is out of sync with modern technology, the challenges that creates for 911 operators, and what the system could actually look like. Let's get into it. Hi, Alex. Thanks so much for joining us to talk about something that I honestly, I guess I've taken for granted, which is the 911 system. So when you dial 911 in an emergency, who picks up the phone and how do they figure out how to help you?
So when you call 911, depending on where you are, that call gets routed to your local public safety answering point or PSAP. So these are essentially call centers that are staffed by emergency communications responders. How they figure out where you are depends on how you're calling. So, if you're calling from a landline, then that landline is registered to a specific address. So it's quite easy to find you. If you're calling from a cell phone, then a little bit more work has to go into it. So the system of locating a caller who's calling from a cell phone is called triangulation. So they look at the cell towers that are sort of closest to you, and based on that, try to triangulate your exact location.
And so I understand the current system was designed for landline phones in the 1970s, right? But technology's evolved a lot since then. We've got cell phones and a lot of things are connected to the internet. So what are the limitations of the system? What kind of challenges are dispatchers dealing with?
So when you have a caller who's calling from a cell phone and let's say that they're standing in an open field, it can be quite easy to sort of locate where that person is. But if you have a caller who's in, say, a skyscraper downtown that's many, many, many floors high, or even in a multi-level parking garage, if that person can't tell you exactly what floor they're on or exactly where they are, then it can be much harder to sort of pinpoint their exact location. So for sure, the system has evolved and, it was based on traditional telephony. It wasn't really initially designed to do cell phone calls at all. And thankfully, we've managed to adapt the system so that it does handle cell phone calls. But we're sort of at a point where the system is maxed out and, technology is continuing to evolve. There's more and more data being gathered. There's sensors everywhere, but there's just no way for all of that data to be accessed by these call centers at these PSAPs.
Mm-hmm. I've always imagined the centers where 911 calls are answered to be these kind of bustling places with a ton of staff and like state-of-the-art technology. And I guess that's not the case. I wonder if you can describe some of these PSAPs to me, maybe some of the smaller ones and like more remote places.
So there's larger PSAPs and there's smaller ones, and they all have sort of varying levels of resources. So, some of the larger ones, particularly in provinces that collect 911 levies, they have a lot more resources and a lot more funding and a lot more technology. And then you have some really, really small PSAPs in some fairly remote areas. And so there's a big discrepancy between, the levels of funding and the levels of technology adoption based on resources.
So are there parts of the country where 911 service is worse than other parts? I imagine there are very specific challenges in the north, for example.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So In sort of Canada's far north, there are some regions where they actually have something that's called basic 911 service. So basic 911 service actually doesn't transmit any location information from people that call in via a cell phone versus enhanced 911, which does. So there are, parts of the country where they only still have this basic 911 service. And then there are still places though where people don't have basic wireless coverage to be able to call 911. There's some steps being taken to resolve that. For example, the Highway of Tears. So the Highway of Tears is sort of a nickname that was given to a section of Highway 16 between Prince George and Prince Rupert in British Columbia. And it got this nickname because of the many Indigenous women who have gone missing or been murdered along that route in the past few decades. There's a bunch of new cell phone towers being built along the Highway of Tears so that people traveling along that highway are going to be able to call 911. So that's great. And so for these regions, graduating to this so-called next generation 911 system is going to be extra hard because they're going to be skipping over enhanced 911 and going straight to this next generation 911. And that's going to take some time. And so that's why companies such as Northwestel, which is a telecom that serves the Yukon, Nunavut, the Northwest Territories, and parts of northern BC and Alberta, has actually asked to sort of be exempted from the deadlines that the CRTC, the Canadian telecom regulator, is setting around implementing 911. They've said that they need a specific plan that is sort of specific to the circumstances of Canada's North.
So you've been reporting on this modernization effort and this overhaul that's happening to the 911 system right now. So can you tell me about what the technology is that they're using and how is it going to improve the service?
Basically, right now, what's happening is the biggest overhaul to emergency communications that we've seen in decades. And this is not just happening in Canada, it's happening worldwide. And so the idea is, right now, 911 is done through sort of a traditional telephone network, like a copper network that was designed for landline phones. And now it's going to be migrated onto an internet protocol-based network. And that's going to come with a lot of advantages. So a lot of the data, for example, that is available, that's out there, that can't be captured by a traditional telephone network is going to be able to be captured in this new system. And so that's going to allow for things like text messaging. So right now, only people who are, deaf or hard of hearing are able to text with 911 or who have difficulty speaking. So they can subscribe to a special service that allows them to text with 911. But once we get onto this new network, everyone will eventually be able to text 911, which can be super helpful if you're in a situation where revealing your whereabouts by speaking could potentially put you in danger. So imagine somebody, for example, hiding out in a school where there's an active shooter and they want to call for help, but they can't because if they speak, then the shooter will find out where they are.
Right.
So that's going to be really helpful. And the new system will also be able to eventually, not right away, but eventually it will be able to let people send photos and videos to 911, which is really helpful in terms of if you have something like a fire or a violent standoff or something, for emergency crews going into the situation to know exactly what to expect, and that can help them prepare. For example, we hear a lot in the news about 5G wireless technology, which is sort of the latest generation of wireless technology, and how it's going to enable all of these amazing new applications. It's going to power, driverless cars, and it's going to power smart cities. We're going to have smart power grids that can turn on and off the lights depending on the lighting conditions. And so there's going to be these thousands of sensors all over collecting all of this data. And some of this data could be really useful in informing our emergency response.
So there's another example in your story that I thought illustrated really well how internet-connected technology could help 911 operators. And it's the sensors in modern cars when you get into a car accident. Could you just explain how that would work?
So basically, in modern cars, there's these sensors that are gathering just tons and tons of information. So for example, if you get into a collision, these sensors can say what the car's speed was at impact. It can say whether the airbags were deployed. Based on how many seatbelts were in use, it can say how many people were likely inside the car during the collision. And so there's something like more than 120 different pieces of information that are being gathered. And that information can be life-saving. It can help a dispatcher at a 911 center figure out, how many people they need to send and what kind of life support technicians they might need, and just generally get a sense of the situation before they arrive. The problem is that the system that we have right now, it's old, right? And it can't directly access this data. So you'd think that we have all this data being gathered, it could just get transmitted directly to the 911 center, but that's not the case. So instead, the auto manufacturers, they staff these call centers where, when you have a collision, like let's say you have OnStar, you pay for OnStar, and you get into a collision, then they will take all of that data from your car and they will call the public safety answering point, and they will transmit all of that data verbally to somebody at the call center who is then typing it into their system by hand, which is not only inefficient, but also creates a lot of potentials for mistakes because these people are typing very, very quickly. And we know that, human error in data entry can be quite high. One of the things I've heard is that there's quite a bit of data being gathered by sort of smart buildings, which could help locate where exactly somebody in a building is if they have an emergency. And that data is also not being transmitted. There's a lot of technology that's sort of evolving and that's going to be implemented around smart cities. So at some point, we'll have sensors that are going to be gathering information on road conditions, on weather situations. So there's tons and tons of technology evolving every day that's going to have this kind of information. And right now, our system isn't equipped to be able to receive it.
I understand that this technology's been around for like 20 years or something. So why do you think it's taken us so long to get to this point of overhauling the system?
Yeah, it's been quite a few years since the standards for Next Generation 911 were set. There's a group called the National Emergency Number Association, NENA, and they sort of set the standard for what Next Generation 911 will be. And they started developing the standards for a new 911 system, which would be called Next Generation 911 in 2003. But you're right in that, it's taken us a while to actually get to this point of trying to implement them. And that is partly because, as they go along and they try to do this Next Gen 911 rollout, what I've been told is that with each step, you kind of discover that there's more stuff that needs to happen. So even NENA has had to go back and, add additional clarity and set additional standards for parts of the system. So that's kind of been part of the process. So it's a bit of like, the further along the road you get, the longer the road sort of becomes. And so that's been sort of a big part of it.
Yeah, I gotta say, it's kind of shocking to me that this stuff hasn't already been implemented. But what's the process for the transition to Next Gen 911 been like? What has that transition entailed?
The transition has been delayed quite a bit. It's sort of been tricky because it's sort of a mission creep situation where the further along they get in trying to plan this, the more they realize that there's all this other stuff that they also need to do. And so the deadlines have been postponed a number of times. And there's a lot of other things that these folks are doing. Most of the people in charge of this transition are actually volunteers and they have day jobs. So it can be really hard sort of to get everyone together and to make sure that all of the work gets done. So it's definitely been a slow process. And you would not be the only only person to say that you're kind of surprised that we don't already have this capability. I mean, as consumers, we have, these phones that are so advanced now, and we can upload and download, massive video files at the blink of an eye. We can communicate through all of these different apps and all of these different modes instantly. And yet, if you want to call 911, I mean, you're still picking up the phone and dialing and speaking to a human being. And so I think a lot of consumers sort of would have expected that we'd be a little further along by now.
You mentioned that the people involved in this transition are volunteers, and I find that kind of interesting. Why are we relying on volunteers to do this? Why aren't these full-time jobs?
That's a great question. I'm actually not sure. My guess would just be resources. Like these PSAPs, these 911 centers, they are quite stretched in terms of resources, some more than others. And so even just finding the money to get this transition to happen is a challenge. And once we do get this new system in place, it's going to be sort of a multi-stage process, right? So first they have to finish building the actual network. Then they have to bring all of the PSAPs online. So the network is actually being built by the telecoms, so Bell, Telus, and SaskTel in Saskatchewan. Then they have to actually onboard all of the PSAPs, meaning connect these call centers directly to the network. And then once they can demonstrate that the network is working, then they have to go and decommission the old system. And so some of the capability that we're going to see, like better location accuracy, text messaging, videos, photos, like that's not going to be instant. That's going to take some time before we actually see all of those capabilities. But yeah, it's going to be very expensive. And then once they do have those capabilities, I mean, now you have all these photos and videos pouring into these call centers. So now you need to train all of the call center staff on how to actually sift through those mountains of data and figure out what to do with it all and which data is relevant and which data isn't. So that's also going to require resources and possibly additional staffing as well.
Yeah, it sounds like a very complicated process and like there are a bunch of hurdles that they have in front of them. But you mentioned funding as one of the challenges. And I'd always thought of 911 as being kind of one of the most like basic services that the government provides. How do we actually fund 911 services?
So there's no consistency really in how 911 services are funded. It kind of varies from one jurisdiction to the other. So in some provinces, there's what's called a 911 levy, where every single person who pays a phone bill has a certain, amount of that phone bill going towards 911 services. Some provinces don't have a provincial 911 levy. And so in those cases, they need to rely on their sort of municipal governments for funding. And so that's also created a bit of a challenge in this whole rollout, because while some jurisdictions already kind of have their financing sorted out, others are having to go to sort of City Hall and say, we need all of this money for this new 911 system, and they have to vote on it and they have to get approvals on it. And so each of the PSAPs is kind of in a different stage in their journey in terms of getting the funding that they need together and, planning this whole process.
Alex, thank you so much. I learned a lot. I appreciate it. All right, that's it for today. I'm Tamara Kendacker. Our producers are Madeline White and Kasia Mihailovich. Thanks to Michal Stein for production on this episode. David Crosby edits the show. Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thanks so much to Alexandra Posadzki. You can follow her on Twitter @AlexPosadzki. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.